There are three underwriting assumptions that I used to accept without hesitation, but I no longer do because I have seen how often they quietly destroy returns. If you spend enough time reviewing real estate deals, a pattern usually starts to emerge. Most deals do not fail because of one dramatic mistake. They could, but in most cases, they fail because several assumptions that look reasonable on paper stack together and reality does not cooperate with the spreadsheet. So, today I want to walk you through three underwriting assumptions that I personally stress test the hardest and why I no longer take them at face value in the current environment. So, number one is year one rent growth. The first assumption that I'm really cautious about is the rent growth in year one. Why? Because it sets the base for with which you start, and secondly, that's the base from which annual year over year growth compounds. In other words, it can have a profound effect on the exit valuation. On paper, 3 to 5% often looks conservative, it feels modest, especially to prior cycles, but in practice, year one rent growth assumes that several things go immediately right. It assumes that leasing friction is minimal. It assumes that turnover happens smoothly. And it assumes that residents absorb the projected increases without resistance. And lastly, it assumes that operations stabilize faster than they often do without after the acquisition. What I have learned is that year one is rarely about growth. Instead, it is about transition. New ownership, new systems, new staff, new processes, all while trying to maintain occupancy and collections. If a deal needs rent growth on day one to work, it is already fragile. Flat rent in year one often turns out to be more conservative, especially in the current environment, and not because growth will not happen, but because timing matters. Assumption number two that I scrutinize heavily is expense compression. I no longer trust that, especially in year one. Expenses are often modeled as a percentage of income, but in real life, expenses behave much more like fixed realities. Insurance does not compress on schedule and overnight. Payroll rarely goes down. Repairs and maintenance do not usually cooperate with budget, especially if you have an older property, and utilities do not care what the spreadsheet says. I often see underwriting that assumes expenses will naturally decline as operations improve, but sometimes that does happen, but not always. And more often than not, expenses rise first, especially in the early stages of the execution while you're getting a hand on the property. Expense compression may look great in model, but reality usually disagrees. When expenses are underestimated, even modest shortfalls in income will get magnified. That is how thin margins disappear quietly. Point number three relates to exit pricing optimism. And this is one I stress the hardest because cap rates have an exponential effect on the valuation. Small changes can erase years of the projected upside. Exit assumptions are often treated as a footnote, but the exit is where a large portion of the total return of the investment is realized, which is why it is extremely important. Exit pricing assumes not just market conditions, but timing, liquidity, and buyer appetite all at the same moment. That is a lot of variables lining up. Exit cap rates are not a rounding error, they are the pro forma return. So when rent growth, expense compression, and optimistic exit pricing all need to be right at the same time, the margin of safety disappears. None of these assumptions look reckless on their own, but when they stack together, the risk compounds quietly. Conservative underwriting is not about modest assumptions, it is about resilience when reality does not follow the plan. And believe me, that often does happen. If you want frameworks that help you stress test deals instead of trusting projections blindly, subscribe to this channel. I focus on how to think about risk before the returns in any market and hope you follow along and enjoy the content.